It had been a while since I took a proper break, and the idea of solitude in the wilderness felt overdue. I was burnt out, tired of hearing phones buzz, emails ping, or even just the sound of my upstairs neighbor's shoes against the hardwood floor. So when I finally got 3 consecutive days off, I packed my backpack, loaded my tent and gear into the car, and drove north toward a remote stretch of forest land near the Upper Peninsula, well past the popular campsites and recreational areas. The place I was heading was an unmarked clearing someone on a backpacking forum had mentioned. No name, just GPS coordinates and a vague warning. Go if you want peace, but be aware of what silence really is. It was early September. The weather had just turned cool enough to sleep comfortably at night, but still warm in the afternoons. I parked about a mile away from the coordinates, hiked in, and pitched my tent beneath a cluster of cedar trees near a narrow stream. There were no other campers, no signs of life, just endless trees, the trickle of water, and the distant call of crows. That first night was quiet, almost too quiet. I remember lying in my tent, waiting for the chorus of forest sounds, the insects, the owls, rustling leaves, but it was all muted, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I chalked it up to being farther out than usual. Still, I slept well. The second day passed uneventfully. I walked a few miles in all directions, marking my trail with biodegradable tape so I wouldn't get turned around. I found deer tracks, some old scat, and what might have been a bear print, though it was half smeared in the mud. I didn't see another person or hear so much as a plane overhead. That evening, I built a small fire and warmed up a can of chili. Just as the sun dipped below the tree line, I heard something, a distant thud. Not the kind of sound made by a falling branch or a squirrel. It was heavy, dull, and deliberate. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth. A few seconds later, it came again. Thud. Then again. Thud. I stood up and looked toward the woods. The fire crackled behind me, and I felt the warmth on my back. The sound came from the north, where the trees were thicker. I squinted, trying to see through the branches, but there was nothing. Just darkening shadows and layers of green. Probably a deer, I muttered to myself, though it didn't feel like a deer. I didn't hear it again that night. It was around 2:17 a.m. I remember because I checked my watch when I woke up to the sound. Not the thuds again. Something else. Whispering. At first I thought it was the wind, but there was no breeze, not even a stir against the tent's thin walls. The whispering grew louder, clearer, though I couldn't make out words. Just the rhythm of a voice speaking quickly, like it was reciting something or praying. It circled the tent slowly. My breath hitched, and I lay perfectly still, clutching my flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. The whisper stopped right outside my head. I turned on the flashlight. Nothing. I waited. Still nothing. Just the sound of my breathing, ragged and uneven. I reached for the zipper of the tent door and hesitated. Then I opened it. No one was there. But the strange thing, the really strange thing, was the line of footprints in the dirt. Bare feet, small, like a child's. They circled my tent once, then stopped at the very spot I heard the whispering. I followed them with the beam of my flashlight, but after a few feet, they just ended. Not faded, not overlapped. They simply stopped as if the person had vanished into thin air. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, the prints were gone, erased, either by the wind or the forest itself. The air felt different, heavier. The birds didn't sing, and even the stream nearby sounded quieter than before. I considered packing up and leaving, but something kept me there. Curiosity, maybe. Or maybe I didn't want to admit that I was scared. I decided to go deeper into the woods, following the direction where the prints had ended. I walked for maybe 2 hours before stumbling upon something unexpected, a small, ruined cabin. Completely off-grid, no trail leading to it, hidden behind a dense curtain of pine. The wood was rotting, the door half off its hinges. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. I should have turned around. Instead, I stepped inside. The air was stale, and the temperature dropped noticeably. There were children's toys scattered across the floor, wooden blocks, a rusted tricycle, a small doll missing an eye. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols carved directly into the timber, spirals and X's and circles with slashes through them. I walked deeper inside and found a small bedroom with a collapsed bed frame and moldy mattress. On the floor was an old leather-bound journal. I opened it. Most of the pages were illegible, but a few entries stood out. They were dated 1956. One read, "She talks to them again, says they want to play. I tell her to stop, but she says they live in the trees, says they whisper when it gets quiet. I nailed the windows shut, but it doesn't stop them. They come anyway. Last night they knocked, not with hands, with their heads." Another entry later on just said, "She's gone. She walked into the woods and they took her. I heard her laughing." I closed the journal and left the cabin, walking faster now, constantly checking over my shoulder. I felt watched. The woods, once peaceful, now seemed filled with something I couldn't explain. Every branch snap made my skin crawl. When I got back to my campsite, the fire pit had been disturbed. The stones I arranged were now in a perfect circle with small, smooth bones placed evenly between them. I didn't bring bones. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't cook dinner. I sat in my tent, clutching my flashlight and knife, heart thudding like a drumbeat in my ears. At exactly 3:11 a.m., I heard the whispering again. This time, it wasn't outside the tent, it was inside. I turned on my flashlight instantly and the whispering stopped. The tent was empty. I checked every corner, every fold of fabric. There was no one there. And yet, the whispering resumed the moment I turned the light off. I turned it back on and didn't dare sleep. By dawn, I had packed everything. I didn't care how tired I was. I just wanted to be out of those woods. I took a different route back, one that cut through a ravine but shaved a mile off the return hike. As I passed through the narrow stretch, I heard footsteps behind me. Not fast, just steady. I turned around and saw no one. I moved faster. The footsteps followed. When I finally saw my car, I ran. I didn't look back until I was inside with the doors locked. There was nothing behind me. But the second I turned the engine on, my headlights illuminated something standing at the edge of the trees. It was small, pale, barefoot. I couldn't tell if it was a child or something mimicking one. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and even from a distance, I could see its mouth moving, whispering. I drove. I didn't stop until I was an hour away. When I got home, I told myself I imagined it, that sleep deprivation and isolation had gotten the better of me. But the journal I took from the cabin still sat in my bag. I opened it again, and the last page, which I swear hadn't been there before, now had fresh handwriting. It said, "You left too late." I burned it in my backyard fire pit, watched the leather bubble and blacken until it was ash. But sometimes when I'm alone and things are too quiet, I still hear the whispering. It's not in the woods anymore. It's in my house. Story the end. The thing about solo camping is that it strips you down to the bare essentials: your gear, your instincts, and your own mind. I'd done it before, plenty of times, but that trip deep in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest turned out to be different from anything I'd expected. It wasn't just the isolation that got to me, it was something else, something I couldn't explain. I had planned the trip for weeks. I'd picked a lesser-known area near Mount Rainier where trails vanished into thick undergrowth and the wilderness was so deep you could lose yourself in it. I wanted quiet and a chance to think. The pandemic had left me drained and anxious, and the idea of being alone, surrounded by nothing but trees and sky, seemed like the best cure. I arrived just as the afternoon sun was starting to dip, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. The trailhead was deserted, except for a single faded sign warning about unpredictable weather and urging caution. I double-checked my pack, tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water, and started hiking. The trail was steep, but well-marked at first. After a couple of hours, I found a small clearing near a babbling stream that seemed perfect for setting up camp. I pitched my tent on a flat patch of mossy ground and gathered firewood, enjoying the peaceful rhythm of the forest. I cooked a simple meal, the smoke from my fire curling into the cool air. As darkness fell, the woods transformed. The cheerful daytime sounds disappeared, replaced by an eerie silence. No insects, no birds, nothing. Just the occasional crack of a twig, but that felt more like a warning than a natural sound. I told myself it was nothing, but a sense of unease settled deep in my chest. Around midnight, while lying in my sleeping bag and staring at the tent ceiling, I heard it. Footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, crunching softly on the forest floor. I sat up, heart pounding, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the clearing was bathed in faint moonlight filtering through the trees. There was nothing there. I called out, voice shaking, but only silence answered. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, this time circling the tent. The sound was too slow and steady to be an animal. My breath caught in my throat when I caught a glimpse of something white moving between the trees just beyond the firelight. I snapped my head around, flashlight in hand, but saw nothing. The night stretched on in a haze of whispered voices and tapping sounds against the tent fabric. Sometimes I thought I could hear faint crying. Sleep was impossible. The next morning, a heavy fog had rolled in, wrapping the forest in a thick, wet blanket. The air was damp and cold, my breath steaming in front of me. I packed up quickly, but before leaving, I noticed something disturbing. Strange symbols carved into several nearby trees. Circles intersected with lines and dots in patterns I couldn't understand. The sap was oozing darkly from the fresh cuts. Unease pressed harder against me as I followed the trail back. The forest seemed alive, watching, waiting. When I reached a clearing I hadn't noticed before, I found an old, crumbling cabin. It looked abandoned for decades, but a faint light flickered inside. I hesitated, then crept closer. Inside, the air was thick and stale. On a rickety table lay an old, water-damaged journal. I picked it up, wiping off the dirt to reveal neat, hurried handwriting dated back over 50 years. The writer was a woman named Clara who had camped in this forest, describing similar experiences: footsteps at night, whispers in the dark, symbols carved into trees. Her last entry ended with a desperate plea. "They won't let me leave. Please, if you find this, don't stay." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I dropped the journal and ran, stumbling back down the trail with the sense that something invisible was closing in on me. When I finally reached my car, the relief was overwhelming, but it was shadowed by the knowledge that the forest had left something behind with me, an unshakable dread that no amount of daylight could dispel. Back home, I researched local legends and found multiple reports of campers vanishing or fleeing the forest in terror. Many spoke of a restless spirit, a woman trapped between worlds, forever wandering, calling out in the night. I kept the journal, and sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I hear faint footsteps outside my window, or the soft tapping on my walls. The forest is still out there, waiting. Story, the end. It was supposed to be just a weekend away from everything. I'd been swamped with work, overwhelmed with social noise, and itching to get out into some real quiet. So I packed up my gear and drove out toward Pine Hollow Reserve, a remote patch of forest land in the northern part of the state that barely anyone visited. There were no designated campgrounds, no nearby ranger station, and certainly no cell signal. That's what drew me in. I arrived late Friday afternoon, just before sunset. The road leading into the woods turned from gravel to dirt and narrowed until I had to park the Jeep and hike the rest of the way in. I followed an old logging trail for about an hour until I found a small clearing nestled between a cluster of pine trees and a moss-covered outcrop. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but it was beautiful. A few birds chirped faintly in the distance, and the smell of damp pine needles filled the air. I set up my one-man tent, built a small fire, and cooked a freeze-dried meal. The temperatures started to drop, and by nightfall, it was chilly enough that I had to zip my jacket all the way up. The fire gave off a gentle orange glow, casting long shadows that stretched and moved with the trees as the flames flickered. I leaned back against a log and stared up at the stars for a while. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. That first night, I went to bed feeling clear-headed. My body was tired, but my mind had started to finally slow down. I must have dozed off quickly, but I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sharp, crisp sound like a stick breaking. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a raccoon snooping around my pack. I held still, listening. The fire had long since burned out, and everything outside the tent was pitch black. Then I heard it again. Not a stick this time. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching the leaves, pausing, then crunching again. I held my breath. The steps circled around the tent, stopping right by my head. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. My heart thudded so loud I could barely hear. I told myself it had to be an animal. Probably a curious one. But the way the steps moved, measured and almost too human, made the hair on my arms stand up. Eventually the steps faded. Whatever it was moved back into the woods, and after nearly an hour of tense silence, I fell asleep again out of sheer exhaustion. The next morning I woke up early. The air was damp, and the clearing was blanketed in thin mist. I stepped out of the tent and looked around. Nothing seemed disturbed. No paw prints, no signs of digging through my supplies. But just behind a tree about 15 feet away, I saw something odd. A narrow groove in the dirt, like someone had dragged a stick or a toe in a line. It curved in a strange loop, and then abruptly ended. I tried not to dwell on it. I chalked it up to an animal marking, or maybe just runoff from the night's dew. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I spent the day hiking to a nearby ridge and back, trying to keep my mind occupied. The woods were beautiful, but unnervingly quiet. Even the birds seemed less active than they should have been. That night, I built a bigger fire, partly for warmth, but mostly for comfort. The flame made me feel like I was anchoring myself in the middle of all that darkness. I sat for hours just staring at the fire, jumping at every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves. I went into the tent around 10, zipped myself in, and kept my flashlight within arm's reach. Sleep came slowly. When I finally did doze off, it was restless and full of strange dreams. I dreamed I was being watched from the trees, countless pairs of eyes blinking in and out of the darkness, all focused on me. Then something woke me again. The sound was faint at first, a scraping like cloth brushing against bark. Then the footsteps again, closer this time, heavier. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The steps came right up to the tent and stopped at my feet. And then a voice, low, hoarse, almost like a breath pushed into sound. It said my name, not shouted, not whispered. Just said it, flat and unemotional. Eli. I froze. My blood ran ice cold. I've never heard my name sound like that before, like it didn't belong to me anymore. I wanted to scream, but my throat locked. I clenched the flashlight, ready to swing if anything unzipped the tent, but nothing happened. After a long pause, the footsteps moved away again, but not in a straight line. They looped the tent twice before fading back into the forest. I stayed awake until dawn. When I stepped out in the morning, I saw more of those grooves in the dirt, but this time there were dozens, curving, looping patterns like someone had paced in long circles around the camp. I walked the perimeter, heart pounding, and found something that made my stomach flip. There was a shape, almost like a figure, crudely drawn in the dirt just behind my tent, a stick figure body with an X where the face should be. Right next to it were two parallel lines, drawn deep and clean, like a pause or a symbol. I packed my things in record time. I didn't even eat breakfast. Every minute I stayed felt like a dare. I threw everything into my pack and started heading back down the trail toward the Jeep. I kept checking behind me, certain I'd see something. I never did. I was about a mile from the Jeep when I started hearing the footsteps again. Behind me, never ahead, never to the sides, just always a few paces back. I'd stop, they'd stop. I'd move, they'd move. I spun around multiple times, flashlight raised, knife in hand. Nothing. Not a person, not an animal, not even the flutter of birds startled from the trees. The woods were dead silent. I don't remember much from the last stretch. It was a blur of adrenaline and anxiety. I got to the Jeep, threw my gear in, and peeled out down the dirt road faster than was probably safe. When I finally reached the highway and my phone picked up signal, I pulled over to catch my breath. I had messages from friends, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. I just sat there, watching the woods shrink in my rearview mirror. For days after I got home, I kept waking in the night thinking I'd heard my name. Once I found a pine needle on my windowsill. My apartment is in the city. There are no pine trees nearby. I tried looking up Pine Hollow Reserve, trying to find stories, legends, anything to explain what I'd experienced. I found only one mention on an old hiking forum, a post from 2011. It was someone asking about the place, saying they'd camped there and heard footsteps at night, saw markings in the dirt, and felt watched. The thread was short, only one reply. "Don't go back," it read. "Some silences aren't empty." I haven't gone back. I never will. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind rattles the windows just right, I still hear it. My name, said like it doesn't belong to me anymore. Story the end. It started as a plan to recharge. Life in the city had grown too noisy. Phones ringing, emails pinging, people talking endlessly about things that never mattered once the day was done. I needed space. Silence. So I decided to take a solo camping trip, something I hadn't done since college. Not the kind of trip where you stay at a designated site with bathrooms and fire pits. I wanted isolation, something that made you remember how small you are in the middle of nature. I drove northwest toward a stretch of dense forest in northern Idaho. It was land that sat just outside any marked park boundaries. No trail maps, no ranger stations, just miles of tall pine and forgotten paths. I had found the area through an old blog post, the kind that had 2 comments from 2009 and hadn't been updated since. The guy who wrote it claimed it was the most peaceful place he'd ever visited, a hidden patch where the trees were thick and the nights so quiet it felt like the air was listening. I arrived in the early afternoon, parking my truck at the end of a dirt road that had all but vanished under grass and gravel. From there, I shouldered my pack and started walking, following an old hunter's trail marked by faded orange tape tied to trees every quarter-mile or so. After about 4 hours of hiking through increasingly rugged terrain, I found a decent clearing next to a thin, slow-moving stream. It was shaded, flat, and far enough from the trail that I wouldn't have to worry about anyone stumbling across me. I pitched my tent and started a small fire just as the light began to fade through the branches. The first night passed in comfortable silence. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sound of the stream and the occasional crack of a twig in the woods. Probably deer, maybe a raccoon. Normal forest sounds. I felt safe, wrapped in the stillness of a place untouched by headlights and sirens. I slept better than I had in months. The second day, I explored. The forest was deep, thick old growth that made it hard to tell the time without checking your watch. I found more remnants of old campsites, a rusted folding chair, a smashed tin can with faded lettering, even a crumpled pack of matches. They were all decayed enough to suggest no one had been out here for a long time, which only made the silence feel more complete. I walked out for a few hours in each direction, careful to mark trees with bits of bright tape I brought just for this reason. Around mid-afternoon, I returned to camp and rested by the stream, watching the light fade into soft purple shadows across the water. That night, I woke to the sound of something moving outside my tent. It wasn't loud, just a steady, deliberate crunch of leaves, not the frantic scuttle of a rodent or the soft pad of a fox. This was heavier, slower. I froze, listening. My watch said it was just past 2 a.m. The footsteps stopped right outside. I sat up slowly, heart thudding, and reached for the flashlight. I didn't turn it on yet. I waited. No breathing, no snorting or sniffing, nothing. Then the zipper on my tent moved. Just a twitch, like something brushed against it. Not hard enough to open it, but enough to let me know it was there. I held my breath. 5 seconds passed, then 10. Then it was gone. No retreating footsteps, no sounds of movement, just gone. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat upright, clutching the flashlight, waiting for dawn. When the sky finally began to lighten, I stepped outside. There were no prints, no broken branches, nothing to suggest anything had been there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling I had been watched. I spent the third day debating whether to stay another night. I didn't want to give in to nerves, but there was a tightness in my chest I couldn't explain. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I collected firewood, flinching at every shift in the wind. By evening, I had made up my mind to leave in the morning. One more night, then I'd hike out. Better to listen to instinct than ignore it. That final night was when everything changed. I built my fire higher than usual and stayed up later. When I finally crawled into the tent, I left my boots on and the flashlight close. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke up again to the sound of a voice. It was faint, just outside. "Help me." My eyes flew open. I held perfectly still. "Please," the voice said again. "I need help." It was male, soft, weak. I unzipped the tent slowly and peered out with my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing, but the voice came again. "Over here, please." It didn't sound right. It was like someone trying to mimic human speech, like a recording played just a little too slow. I stood up, heart hammering, and called out, "Where are you?" No answer. I walked to the edge of the clearing, shining the light into the darkness. Then I saw him. Just for a second. A figure standing between 2 trees, tall and unmoving, his face obscured by shadows. I called again. "Do you need help?" He didn't move, didn't speak. I raised the flashlight and stepped closer. The figure vanished. Not walked away. Vanished. Like a reflection that flickers and disappears. I turned back toward my tent and saw something that made my legs go weak. My fire was out. I hadn't put it out. And there were handprints, dozens of them, pressed into the outside walls of my tent, not smeared, not dirty, just imprints, like pressure had been applied by invisible hands. I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the cold ashes of the fire, clutching the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other, waiting for the sky to turn gray again. At first light, I packed everything in under 20 minutes and started hiking out. The forest felt tighter than before. The light didn't seem to reach the ground, and I lost the trail tape twice. The GPS refused to connect. I kept moving in the direction I thought was right, but nothing looked familiar. Around midday, I stumbled into another clearing. Not mine. This one had the remains of an old wooden shack, just 4 walls, partially caved in. I could smell rot from several feet away. Inside there were bones. Animal, I told myself. Probably deer, maybe elk. But there was also a boot, just one. And next to it, a melted, unrecognizable phone. I backed out and turned around. That's when I heard it again. Help me. This time, the voice came from inside the shack. I ran. I didn't stop to look back, didn't try to follow the trail. I just ran until my legs gave out. When I collapsed, I didn't know how far I'd gone or what direction I was facing. I sat in the dirt and waited until my hands stopped shaking. I pulled out the emergency flare and fired it. Nothing happened for hours. Then, just before sunset, I saw lights, headlamps, and 2 rescue volunteers from the county. My sister had called them when I missed my check-in. They said I had wandered more than 8 miles from the trail. If I'd kept going the way I was heading, I would have missed the forest boundary and kept walking into deeper wilderness, maybe for days. I didn't tell them everything. Just enough. Strange noises. Something in the woods. Fear. Back home, I tried to forget about it. I deleted the photos from the trip. Burned my journal. I don't camp anymore. Not alone, not even in groups. Last week, I got a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single thing, a strip of faded orange trail tape. I hadn't told anyone I used that color. Story the end. I had been solo camping for years, mostly as a way to disconnect from everything. I worked in IT, long hours, lots of screens, endless troubleshooting. Camping was the only way I felt like a person again. No calls, no alerts, no noise, but the forest. That summer, I decided to try somewhere different, away from the more popular national parks. A guy I met at a gear shop told me about a stretch of undeveloped wilderness near the border of Idaho and Montana. It didn't show up on most recreational maps, but he swore by it, said the views were worth it, and that he'd only ever run into 1 or 2 other people the entire time he hiked there. It sounded perfect. I took a few days off, packed light but smart, and drove up a set of forestry roads until my GPS lost signal. I parked where the road ended and started in. There wasn't a real trail, just animal paths and terrain reading. I had a topo map, a compass, and a decent idea of where I wanted to camp, an area near a river bend that looked like it had a natural clearing. The first day was uneventful. It took longer than I thought to bushwhack my way to the spot, but I made it just before dusk. The clearing was more overgrown than it looked on the map, but I cleared a small space and set up my tent. The sound of the river nearby was constant and calming, the kind of white noise that sinks into your bones and slows your thoughts. I made a fire, boiled water for dinner, and leaned back on a log to eat and listen. The woods were alive with crickets, frogs, and the occasional hoot of an owl. The stars came out in full force, no light pollution for miles, and I sat in the glow of the fire until I got too tired to stay upright. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The second day was when things started to shift. I spent the morning exploring upstream, following the curve of the river as it wove through old trees and moss-covered rocks. I saw signs of deer, maybe elk. It was peaceful. When I got back to camp around mid-afternoon, I noticed something small and strange. My pack had been moved, not opened, not rummaged through, just shifted. I always left it propped against the same log, but now it was about a foot away from it. That wouldn't normally mean much. Wind, maybe? But it was heavy, too heavy for a breeze. Still, I told myself it wasn't anything, just me being paranoid. That night, I made a fire again, but the forest felt different. I noticed it around sundown. The sounds had faded. The frogs had stopped. The insects were quiet. That stillness isn't normal, not even in the deep woods. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't help feeling watched, like something was just beyond the tree line, standing there, silent. I ate fast and got in the tent before the fire even died. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with the sense that someone was near me. Not a noise, not a movement, just that pressure of presence. I lay there, eyes open in the dark, ears straining. Then I heard it, barely audible, right outside the tent wall. Breathing, long, slow, and rhythmic, like someone was crouched just inches from me. I held my breath, heart thudding in my chest. I couldn't bring myself to unzip the tent. I couldn't even sit up. I just lay there locked in place until the breathing slowly faded and I must have passed out from exhaustion or fear. When morning came, I stumbled out into the clearing. Nothing was disturbed, no footprints, no animal tracks, just that same unnatural silence. Even the birds weren't calling. I debated leaving then, but the stubborn part of me didn't want to admit how scared I was. I told myself it was probably an animal, that I was letting the isolation get to me. I drank some coffee, repacked my gear, and decided to stay one more night. I moved my tent farther from the river, closer to a rocky incline. It didn't feel safer, just different. The third night was worse. I sat in the dark, no fire this time, listening. Hours passed. Then, sometime around midnight, I heard it again, breathing. But this time it came from the other side of the tent. Then another set, then another. 3 distinct sources of breathing surrounding my tent, no voices, no footsteps, just breathing. They stayed for what felt like forever, sometimes getting closer, sometimes pulling back. I didn't move. I couldn't. Eventually the sound faded. I think I stayed awake the rest of the night, eyes wide open, knife gripped in one hand. At first light, I packed everything. I didn't eat, didn't brush my teeth, just jammed my gear into my pack and took off in the direction I came from. I didn't look back. The forest felt heavier now. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, every rustle made me jump. But the worst part, I never found my way out. By late afternoon, I knew I should have hit the road where I left my car, but it wasn't there. I thought I'd gone in a straight line, but now I was staring at a stretch of woods I didn't recognize. I circled back, climbed a ridge to get a better view. Nothing, just endless trees. Then I saw it, a clearing, not mine, a different one. There was no tent, no signs of people, but there was something else. In the middle was a small, weather-worn wooden chair, facing away from me, angled toward the trees. I thought maybe it was left by hunters or loggers. I don't know why, but I walked toward it. When I got about 10 feet away, I stopped because on the chair, carefully balanced on the seat, was a pile of stones. Small ones, round and flat, stacked in a perfect tower. Just like cairns hikers use, but this wasn't near any trail. No reason for it to be here. And they were still damp, like someone had just placed them. I turned around and left the clearing. Ran, actually. I stopped thinking about where I was going. I just moved, legs burning, lungs tight. I didn't stop until the sun dipped low, and I found a patch of flat ground near a large fallen tree. I set my tent, but I didn't go inside. I sat against the tree, knife in hand, waiting. No breathing that night. But around 3 a.m., I saw something. Not a shape, exactly. More like a shift. The way the darkness behind the trees seemed to bend, like the shadows were thicker in one spot. I stared at it, not blinking. It didn't move, but it didn't feel still either. Eventually, I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, I tried again to find my way back. I followed the sun, kept my compass out, tried every method I'd learned. Hours passed. Then, sometime in the early afternoon, I saw something up ahead. My car. Exactly where I'd left it. No sound, no transition, just suddenly there. I sprinted to it, threw my gear in, and drove for miles before I got a signal again. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't know what to say. It didn't make sense. There's no ghost story to tell. Just presence. Wrongness. That was 3 years ago. Last week, I found something on my balcony. A small stack of round, flat stones, balanced perfectly, still damp, story the end. I've always liked being alone, not in the antisocial way people usually mean, but in the quiet, comfortable way, where the silence doesn't feel like a void, but a space to breathe. That's why I started solo camping about 4 years ago. Most people think it's dangerous, and maybe it is, but danger never bothered me much. What happened last fall, though, shook that foundation in a way I'm still trying to reconcile. I had a 3-day weekend from work, and with no responsibilities hanging over my head, I decided to head out to a section of national forest land in western Oregon. I'm not going to name the exact area for reasons that will become obvious, but it wasn't far from an old fire service road. Completely undeveloped, no campsites, and very rarely trafficked. I'd been there once before the previous summer and remembered it as a peaceful spot where the air smelled like pine and everything felt untouched. I packed light, just my tent, sleeping bag, a jet boil for coffee, and enough freeze-dried food to last 3 days. I left early Friday morning and arrived at the trailhead around 10 a.m. The plan was to hike in about 4 miles and pitch camp near a small creek that ran through a low basin between two ridges. The hike was uneventful, although I saw more animal sign than usual, scat, scratch marks on trees, and even a deer carcass picked clean down to the bone. That didn't bother me. Nature's just doing its thing, right? I got to the clearing a little after noon and set up camp. It was a perfect spot, flat, dry, shaded, and just close enough to the creek to be useful without being noisy. I spent the afternoon reading and sketching trees in my notebook. I didn't see another person all day, which suited me fine. The first night passed quietly. It was colder than I expected, but I had my thermal bag and kept warm. The forest sounds were normal. Crickets, the occasional rustle of a raccoon or possum, maybe even a distant coyote. I slept well. The next morning, I woke up to find that something had moved the items outside my tent. My boots, which I always keep directly in front of the entrance, were sitting off to the side, like someone had picked them up and set them down. My water bottle was upright, but no longer on the rock where I left it. It was about 3 feet away. I looked around for tracks, thinking maybe an animal had nosed through my stuff, but there were none. The ground was dry and nothing was disturbed except the arrangement of my belongings. I shrugged it off, figured maybe I had misremembered exactly where I'd left things. That day I hiked up one of the nearby ridges to get a better view of the area. It's a habit I have to always see the terrain from above at least once. I brought my small binoculars, looked around, and again saw no one. No trails, no distant fires, no signs of other campers. That made what I saw on the way back even stranger. About halfway down the ridge, in a grove of young alder trees, I saw what looked like a piece of fabric caught on a branch. As I got closer, I realized it was a strip of faded blue flannel, about 2 inches wide, tied in a tight knot. The cloth was old, sun-bleached, and frayed, and it gave me a strange feeling. Someone had been here, but it didn't look recent. The fabric had almost become one with the bark. There were others, too, 3 more strips tied to branches about 50 feet apart, forming a vague line that led downhill toward where my camp was. I followed them halfway before losing the trail. I didn't find anything else. No campsite, no trash, not even a fire ring. Just those strips of cloth. I pocketed one out of curiosity and headed back. That night I couldn't sleep. It wasn't the usual insomnia or a restless mind. It was like my body refused to relax. I kept hearing small noises, always just at the edge of my hearing. A twig snapping, leaves brushing together, something soft dragging across the dirt. I turned on my flashlight several times but never saw anything. At around 3 a.m., I finally started to drift off when I heard a voice, a low, breathy whisper. Go. That's all it said, just that one word. I bolted upright. My flashlight was already in hand, and I shined it toward the entrance of the tent. No one. I unzipped it quickly, heart pounding, and shined the beam in a wide arc. Again, nothing. I got out, circled the tent, checked the tree line, checked my gear. No footprints, no sign that anyone or anything had been near me. And yet I knew what I heard. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't imagined. It was real. I considered packing up right then and there, but something about the darkness and the distance to my car made that idea seem worse than staying. So I sat by the fire pit, fed it a few sticks, and stayed awake until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I began to question myself. Maybe I had been half asleep. Maybe it had been wind or an animal vocalization distorted by the trees. I've always trusted my own mind, but that morning it felt slippery, unreliable. Still, I decided to stay the final day. One more night, I told myself. I was being paranoid. Around noon, while I was filtering water by the creek, I found something that broke any remaining sense of calm I had. Lodged between two stones in the stream was a small metal pendant. It was tarnished and dull, but I could still make out the shape, a child's face etched into the silver, eyes closed, mouth slightly open like in sleep. There were no markings, no chain, and it hadn't been there the day before. I was sure of it. I picked it up and felt a chill despite the sunlight on my neck. It wasn't cold, just wrong. It felt wrong in my hand. I left it there. That evening, as the sun dipped low, the forest went quiet again. Not just quiet, dead. No wind, no water sounds, no animals, even the insects had gone silent. I've heard of that happening before, usually when a predator is near, but this felt deeper than that, like the whole forest was retreating from something. I decided not to sleep in the tent. I packed everything but left the tent standing and took my sleeping bag to the edge of the clearing, far enough away that I'd have a view of the tent from a distance, but close enough to run back to it if needed. I positioned myself between two large fir trees and didn't start a fire. I stayed awake well past midnight. The quiet stretched on, unbearable in its totality. Then, at around 2:30 a.m., I saw movement. Someone, or something, was standing by my tent. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but then it shifted. A figure, tall and still, head tilted slightly to one side. It didn't move like a person. It didn't sway or adjust or shift its weight. It just stood there as if it were growing out of the ground. I stayed completely still. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't blink. The figure bent down, touched the tent, then stood up again. And then it turned to face me. It was too far to see details, but I swear it had no face. Not that it was covered or obscured, it simply wasn't there. Like the space where a face should be was missing, smoothed over like clay before features are carved in. It didn't walk toward me. It didn't run. It glided. I don't know how else to describe it. One moment it was by the tent. The next, it was 10 feet closer. I bolted. I ran into the woods, not caring where I was going, just putting distance between me and that thing. Branches tore at my arms, rocks dug into my shoes, but I didn't stop until I tripped and tumbled down a slope, landing hard near the creek. I stayed there, crouched in the mud, trying not to breathe too loudly. I never saw it again. At first light, I climbed back up, keeping low, ears straining for any sound. When I returned to the campsite, the tent was gone. Not collapsed. Not torn. Gone. The spot where it had stood was undisturbed. No poles, no stakes, no drag marks. Just flat pine needles. My gear, what I hadn't packed, was still there. My backpack, my food, even my coffee mug. But no tent. I didn't wait. I stuffed what I could into my pack and ran the trail back to the car. The forest stayed quiet the whole way. No birds, no wind, no sounds, just my footsteps and my heartbeat. When I reached my car, I unlocked it, threw my pack in, and drove without looking back. It's been months now. I haven't been camping since. I haven't told anyone about this. Not fully. I sometimes hear whispers at night, just as I'm drifting off. Soft, breathy phrases I can't quite make out. I tell myself it's nothing. But some mornings I wake up to find my boots moved. Just a few feet. Just like before. Story the end. It was late September when I decided to go camping alone in the forest outside of my small hometown. The days were still warm, but the nights carried the unmistakable chill of early autumn. I needed to clear my head, away from the noise and stress of city life and the mounting pressures at work. I'd been camping before, but always with friends and usually in well-traveled areas with designated campsites. This time, I wanted something different, truly remote, something wild. After some online research, I picked a spot deep in the national forest, miles from any road, along a little-known hiking trail. The place was a patch of dense trees with a small clearing near a creek, tucked far away from the main trails and campgrounds. I planned to hike in, set up my tent, spend 2 nights, and hike back out. The day started out well enough. The drive to the trailhead took most of the morning, then I strapped on my pack and headed in around noon. The trail was rugged, barely maintained, with fallen trees and patches of mud slowing my pace. The forest was thick with oak and pine, the sunlight filtering in unevenly. Birds called occasionally, but there wasn't much other wildlife around. I liked the solitude. By mid-afternoon, I reached the clearing near the creek. It was just big enough for my tent, flat and mostly clear of underbrush. I set up camp quickly, got a fire going, and boiled some water for dinner. The creek babbled softly nearby, the sound oddly comforting. As twilight fell, the forest settled into its nighttime rhythms. The temperature dropped sharply, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. That first night, everything was quiet except for the creek and the occasional call of an owl. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the gentle sounds of the woods. Around 2 a.m., I woke suddenly to the sound of footsteps crunching leaves outside my tent. I froze, heart pounding, straining to listen. The steps circled slowly, deliberately, moving around the perimeter of my small clearing. The noises were too measured to be a deer or other wild animal. My mind raced, imagining a lost hiker or maybe a hunter passing by. I whispered out, "Hello?" No answer. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent wall near my head and stayed still for a long moment. Then, with a faint rustle, they retreated slowly into the darkness. I didn't sleep again for the rest of the night, listening for any return of those footsteps. Morning brought little relief. The forest looked unchanged, peaceful as ever, but a sense of unease lingered. I packed up some gear and walked down the creek a little, trying to shake the nervous energy. On the bank, I noticed something odd, a series of shallow impressions in the dirt and leaves. They looked like footprints, but irregular, almost like they'd been made by something dragging rather than walking. The prints looped around in strange patterns, too intricate to be random animal tracks. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the roots had shifted the soil oddly, or the wind had rearranged fallen leaves. But the patterns stuck in my mind all day. I didn't see any other hikers, and my phone had no signal anyway. The second night was worse. I made a bigger fire and stayed up longer, staring into the flames. Just before midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time they weren't just outside the tent. They circled me, getting closer with every pass. I held my breath and grabbed my flashlight, shining it through the tent mesh. Nothing but darkness. The noise was too close, moving just beyond the firelight's reach. Then a low whisper floated through the night. I couldn't make out words, just a breathy sound, like someone trying to speak but choking on the words. It seemed to come from every direction at once. I shivered uncontrollably and pulled my jacket tighter. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped dead outside the tent's front flap. I turned the flashlight beam toward it. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a shape, something tall and thin, hunched just outside, outlined faintly by moonlight. Then it vanished. I packed up immediately, not caring about the cold or darkness. I wanted to get out. But as I scrambled down the trail toward my car, the feeling of being watched never left me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes made me jump. Once back in my car, safe on the paved road, I called my best friend to pick me up from the trailhead. As we drove back to town, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us on the road. Over the following days, the experience stayed with me. I looked for local stories, folklore, anything about strange happenings in that part of the forest. I found a few old news articles about people who had disappeared in those woods over the decades, sometimes hikers who never returned. Some mentioned strange sightings, shadows moving in the trees, whispering voices carried on the wind. The last unsettling detail came a week later. I was unpacking my gear when I found a small, roughly carved wooden figurine hidden inside my tent bag, a tiny human shape with no facial features, crudely made. I'd never seen it before and had no idea how it got there. I tossed it into the trash without looking back. The forest had marked me, and I knew I'd never truly escape it. Story the end. The plan was simple. Spend 3 days alone in the wilderness, disconnecting from the world. I'd been overwhelmed with work and the constant hum of city life, the traffic, the endless notifications, the noise that never truly stopped. I needed to find peace, something primal and raw. Solo camping seemed the answer. Just me, the forest, and a tent. I chose a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains, a place not far from a small town called Mill Creek. The spot was largely unmarked on maps, away from established campgrounds, and perfect for solitude. From what I read, it was quiet, untouched, and there were no cell towers for miles. A perfect escape. I packed light but smart. Tent, sleeping bag, water filter, some food, and a small first aid kit. I left my phone in airplane mode with GPS on in case of emergency, but no reception expected. I wanted to trust my instincts. I drove late afternoon, taking a winding dirt road that led deep into the forest. The sun was dipping when I found a small clearing near a shallow creek where I planned to set up camp. The trees towered above, dense and dark, their thick branches blotting out much of the fading light. I liked the place. It felt untouched, quiet, except for the gurgle of the creek and the occasional bird call. I pitched the tent, gathered wood for a fire, and settled in. That first night was peaceful. The fire crackled gently, and the temperature dropped rapidly once the sun went down. I was lulled to sleep by natural sounds, an owl's hoot, the rustling of small animals moving in the underbrush. Nothing out of the ordinary. The next day, I decided to explore the area. I wanted to get a sense of the forest, the lay of the land. I followed an old, narrow deer trail, careful not to stray too far from camp. The undergrowth was thick, the ground uneven with fallen branches and moss-covered rocks. I spotted some deer tracks and the distant flicker of a red fox darting between trees. But as the afternoon wore on, the forest grew strangely silent. The birds stopped calling. Even the wind seemed to have died down. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I stopped and looked around, uneasy. The silence was unnatural. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just imagining things. I turned back and found my way to a narrow ridge that overlooked a shallow valley. The view was breathtaking, endless layers of blue-green hills fading into the horizon. I snapped a few photos, then made my way back to camp. That night, things changed. I was just about to crawl into my sleeping bag when I heard it, a faint tapping sound against the tent fabric, like nails or twigs softly rapping on the outside. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate. "Hello," I called, voice trembling slightly. Silence. The tapping stopped. I unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The fire was low, smoldering. I scanned the darkness with my flashlight. Nothing but trees. I shook my head. Must be an animal. I zipped up, but sleep was elusive. Every crack and snap in the forest made me jump. I told myself to stay calm, but the air in the tent suddenly felt thick, heavy with something unseen. Around midnight, I woke again. This time it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps crunching on dry leaves right outside the tent. My heart hammered. I held my breath, willing it to stop. Then came a voice. Whispered, barely audible. "Help me." I sat upright, flashlight gripped tight. "Who's there?" Silence. The footsteps retreated slowly, fading into the distance. I stayed awake the rest of the night, eyes fixed on the tent zipper. Morning brought relief. The sun filtered softly through the trees, and the forest resumed its usual sounds, the birds chirping, the creek babbling. But the unease lingered. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just a prank of my mind, but I wasn't so sure. On the third day, I decided to break camp early and head back. As I packed, I noticed something strange. On the outside of the tent, near the zipper, were faint handprints. Not dirty or muddy, just impressions in the fabric, as if something cold and invisible had pressed against it. I touched the marks, feeling an odd chill. A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, and I shivered despite the heat. I hurried to finish packing, eager to leave. As I walked back along the trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder, the forest feeling alive in a way that unsettled me. About an hour into my hike, I heard the voice again. "Help me." This time it was clearer, more desperate. I spun around, flashlight raised. There, standing just beyond the trees, was a figure. Tall, thin, almost translucent in the morning light, the face was blurred like looking through a fogged window. "Who are you?" I whispered, stepping closer. The figure raised a hand, pointing deeper into the woods. Then, without another sound, it vanished. My breath caught. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure what I'd just seen. I debated following, but instinct screamed to keep moving away. I quickened my pace and soon broke free of the forest, reaching the dirt road where I'd left my truck. I didn't look back. When I got home, I told a few close friends what happened. Some said I must have been hallucinating. Others suggested stress or exhaustion. But one of them, who knew local history, looked uneasy. "There's a story about Mill Creek," he said quietly. "Years ago, a man went missing in those woods. Search parties never found him. Some say his spirit still calls for help, trapped between worlds." I looked up the story later. The man was a hunter who disappeared in the early 1900s. His body was never recovered. Locals said he vanished near the creek I camped by. I don't know if what I experienced was a ghost or something else, but I do know I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. Sometimes the wilderness holds secrets best left alone. Story the end. I'm going to share something that still feels unreal to me. Something I experienced on a solo camping trip that I keep trying to rationalize but can't. I've always been a solo camper. It's my way to unwind, to disconnect from the noise and chaos of everyday life. I prefer quiet, isolated spots where cell reception disappears and it's just me and nature. The woods around my hometown have been my go-to for years, but one summer I decided to venture farther, to a place a friend had casually mentioned, an old forest deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It was supposed to be untouched, rarely visited, and perfect for solitude. I packed my gear, mapped the route as best as I could with a paper map and compass, and headed out on a Thursday afternoon. The drive was long but peaceful. When I arrived at the forest edge, I found a small gravel parking lot with a sign that said Trailhead Private Land Permission Required. There was no one around, no signs of recent visitors, just silence. I didn't have permission, I knew that, but something about the place called me. The friend who'd told me about it said the land was mostly ignored by its owners, and no one patrolled it. I figured I'd be careful, leave no trace, and be out before dark. The trail was barely a path, more a game trail that twisted through dense underbrush and thick trees. After an hour, the forest seemed to close in tighter, branches and leaves brushing against my arms and face. The light filtered dimly through the canopy. I felt the familiar thrill of isolation, but also a creeping sense of unease. The birds were silent, and the wind was unnervingly still. I chalked it up to the time of day and pushed forward. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing beside a narrow creek. The area was serene, moss-covered rocks, ferns, and wildflowers. It looked like the perfect spot to set up camp. I pitched my tent carefully and collected firewood nearby. As I worked, I felt like I was being watched, but each time I turned around, there was nothing but empty forest. I shrugged it off as nerves. It was my first time in such deep wilderness alone, after all. That night, I made a fire and cooked a simple dinner. The stars came out through breaks in the trees, and the crackling fire was comforting. I lay back, listening to the creek babble nearby. But then I noticed something odd. Faint tapping sounds coming from the trees just beyond the firelight. At first, I thought it was just branches knocking against each other in the breeze, but the air was still. The tapping was rhythmic and deliberate. I stood, scanning the darkness with my flashlight, but I saw nothing. The tapping stopped. I went back to my spot and tried to ignore it, blaming my imagination. Still, sleep didn't come easy. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a sensation that someone or something was right outside my tent. I wasn't sure if it was a sound or a feeling. I held my breath and strained to listen. A faint rustling noise, like footsteps shuffling softly through leaves. I didn't move, not even to breathe. The noise came closer, slow, deliberate, then stopped right outside my tent flap. My heart pounded so loud I thought it would give me away. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting, frozen in place. Minutes passed. Then nothing. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and finally drifted into a restless sleep. Morning brought some relief. I packed up, eager to leave the strange silence behind. As I walked back along the trail, I noticed the underbrush looked different. Broken branches and crushed leaves were scattered in an irregular path alongside the trail, almost like someone had been trailing me. The thought made my skin crawl. I quickened my pace, scanning behind me, but saw nothing. At the trailhead, I took a deep breath, happy to be out of the woods. I got into my car and drove away without looking back. A week later, I was restless and decided to try solo camping again, this time closer to home. I returned to a small state park I knew well. The weather was warm and dry, and the park was mostly empty midweek. I set up my tent in a designated site, built a fire, and settled in for the night. As darkness fell, I thought about the trip to the Appalachian forest. The memory of those noises haunted me. That night, I heard the tapping again. This time, it was right outside my tent, light and irregular, like fingers drumming on wood. I zipped the tent shut and lay still, heart racing. Then came a whisper, almost indistinct, like someone exhaling close by. It was too soft to make out words. I wanted to convince myself it was just the wind, but the air was still. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping my flashlight. The next morning, I found something strange near the edge of my campsite. Small stones arranged in a loose circle around a tree stump. I hadn't seen them there the day before. They weren't just scattered, they were placed carefully, almost ritualistically. I couldn't explain it. I packed up quickly and left. Over the next several weeks, I tried to avoid solo camping, but the pull was too strong. I returned a few times, always to familiar woods or quiet spots. But something followed me. At each site, I found those small stone circles, always placed where I hadn't noticed them before. The tapping and whispers would come after dark. Once I saw a shadow dart between trees just at the edge of my vision. When I looked, there was nothing. I started sleeping with a knife. I never heard voices clearly, just sounds. Breaths, tapping, rustling leaves, always just beyond the firelight or tent walls. One night, back in my apartment, I dreamt I was back in that Appalachian clearing. The fire was out. The shadows moved and bent like liquid. Something sat in the chair made of branches that I'd imagined. It turned slowly to face me. I woke with a start, heart pounding. The next morning, I found a single flat stone on my doorstep. No explanation, no footprints around it. I still camp, but I never stay more than one night anymore. I avoid places without marked trails. I don't go deep in anymore. And I never ever leave my tent unzipped after dark. Sometimes when the night is quiet and I'm alone in the woods, I hear the tapping, and I wonder if something's just watching, waiting, always close by. Story the end. I'd always been drawn to the woods alone. The solitude, the sound of wind through pine needles, the crackling fire under a sky so vast it made you feel both insignificant and infinite. That was my sanctuary. I started solo camping years ago, and it became something I looked forward to. Most of the time it was peaceful, refreshing, and grounding. But one trip last fall changed that. I planned the trip for weeks, choosing a remote area deep in the Cascades. It was an old logging region, mostly abandoned for decades, with just faint trails left behind. I had no cell service, no neighbors for miles, and I liked it that way. My goal was to camp near a ridge overlooking a small alpine lake, a place I'd heard was serene and rarely visited. I wanted quiet and a little challenge, nature unscripted. I left early Friday morning. The air was crisp and clean, the kind of freshness that sinks deep into your lungs. My pack was light but thorough. Tent, sleeping bag, water filter, a few days' worth of freeze-dried meals, a small first aid kit, my journal, and a headlamp. I carried a couple of books, but I figured I wouldn't read much, mostly just listen to the forest. The hike in was tougher than I expected. The trail, if you could call it that, was overgrown with brush and fallen logs. A few times I had to detour steeply around muddy patches and old stumps. The forest was dense and dark under the canopy, and I noticed how few bird calls there were. Usually the woods hum with wildlife. Here it felt strangely silent. Not dead quiet, but as if the forest was holding its breath. By mid-afternoon, I found a flat clearing beside a narrow stream not far from the lake. I set up my tent, collected firewood, and brewed coffee. The lake shimmered faintly beyond the trees, its surface glassy and still. I dipped my hand into the cold water, shivered, and smiled to myself. This was what I came for. That night, the forest sounded alive in its own way. Owls called in the distance, frogs croaked from the wetlands, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. I sat by the fire, scribbling notes about the shapes of trees and the way the light filtered through the branches. I felt completely alone, but in a way that was comforting rather than lonely. Around 2 a.m., I woke up abruptly. Something had woken me, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails on wood, coming from just outside the tent. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was a raccoon or maybe a squirrel climbing a tree nearby. But the noise didn't move upward. It stayed steady, rhythmic, deliberate. I zipped open the tent flap and shone my headlamp outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the fire pit and the surrounding brush. Nothing moved. Nothing showed eyes reflecting the light. The sounds stopped. Silence swallowed the woods again. I went back inside, locked the tent, and lay awake until dawn. The next day, I decided to hike around the lake and explore. The terrain was rugged, thick underbrush, mossy rocks, and slippery mud near the shore. As I walked, I noticed strange symbols scratched into tree bark, simple shapes like circles with crosses inside them, sometimes a spiral. They weren't recent. The bark had started to grow over some of the markings, but they were definitely man-made. I photographed a few and collected a small piece of bark with a spiral etched deeply into it. I was curious, but uneasy. Who would come this far? The forest was so remote and the trail so difficult that hardly anyone would visit, let alone leave signs like these. That afternoon, I returned to camp and found my tent door unzipped halfway. I was sure I had closed it tightly. Inside, nothing was missing, but my journal lay open on the ground, pages scattered by the breeze. I flipped through it, and my notes seemed jumbled, as if someone had rifled through the pages and then put it back haphazardly. It was unnerving, but I told myself I'd likely left it that way. As evening crept in, a thick fog began to rise from the lake, swallowing the trees and softening the edges of the world. The fire was harder to keep alive, dampened by the heavy moisture in the air. I packed up the fire early and crawled into the tent. That night, the noises started again, only louder and closer. This time, it wasn't just scratching. There were low moans, like distant voices crying out, barely audible, carried on the wind. The scratching returned, now on the other side of the tent, circling slowly, as if something or someone was walking around me in the dark. I was frozen, heart pounding, my flashlight in hand. The sound stopped abruptly, and the air grew still. Then came a whisper, just beneath the crack of the tent. Go! It was the same single word, a breathy hiss filled with warning. I flung the tent open and pointed my light around, but nothing was there. The fog had thickened, and the trees loomed like shadowy giants. My blood ran cold as I realized the voice was unmistakably female, soft but chilling. I stayed outside for a while, pacing and calling out, but only the fog answered. When I finally crawled back in, I couldn't sleep again. Morning brought no relief. The fog had not lifted. Instead, it seemed to cling to the forest floor, curling between trunks and snaking through the underbrush. I wanted to leave, but I was stubborn and a little foolish, determined not to let fear ruin the trip. While packing, I noticed my boots had shifted from their place by the tent entrance. Not just a few inches, they were turned almost completely around, soles up. I stared at them, unease creeping in, then stepped back. I made my way toward the lake for one last look. The fog gave everything an eerie softness, turning trees into ghostly shapes and water into a liquid mirror. As I walked, I caught sight of a figure standing on the far shore, a woman in a tattered white dress, pale and still. I called out, but she didn't move or respond. As I blinked, she vanished. I shook my head, thinking I must be exhausted or delirious. Maybe the fog was playing tricks. Back at camp, I found more of the strange symbols carved into nearby trees arranged in a rough circle around my tent. They seemed fresh this time, the bark still moist where the cuts were deepest. Panic rose in me like bile. I grabbed my pack and started hiking out. The trail was harder to follow, swallowed by fog and shadows. The forest felt alive with eyes watching me. Branches brushed my face, sticks snapped underfoot, and that whisper floated through the trees again, soft and urgent, leave. I didn't stop until I reached my car. When I looked back, the fog was thinning, but for a moment, I thought I saw a pale face pressed against the window of the tent. A woman's face, eyes hollow and dark, lips moving silently. I haven't camped alone since. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed, I still hear the whisper, and sometimes when I open my journal, I find a page I don't remember writing, a message scrawled in shaky script, "Go before it's too late." Story the end. The early morning mist clung thick to the trees as I stepped out of my car at the trailhead. The air smelled damp, heavy with pine and moss, the kind of freshness you don't find in cities. I was alone, as planned. No friends, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. I'd been wanting to do a solo camping trip for years, ever since I first fell in love with the idea of disconnecting from the chaos of everyday life. This time, I chose a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains, a rugged patch of forest known for its dense growth and narrow, barely maintained trails. My pack was heavy, loaded with the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water, and a first aid kit. I had my phone for emergency calls, but I knew there wouldn't be any signal this far in. That was part of the appeal. The hike started easy enough, the trail winding through towering hardwoods and the occasional outcrop of granite. The forest was alive with the chatter of birds and the rustle of small animals. I breathed in deeply, feeling the tension from months of city noise and work stress begin to melt away. After about 3 hours of hiking, I came to a small clearing near a creek. The spot was perfect, flat, dry, surrounded by tall trees that shielded the wind. I pitched my tent and gathered firewood, building a small campfire that crackled and sent sparks drifting into the dimming sky. I cooked a simple dinner, then sat by the fire watching the shadows dance. As twilight deepened, a strange stillness settled over the forest. The birds stopped singing, and even the creek seemed quieter, as if the night was holding its breath. I shrugged off the uneasy feeling and crawled into my tent with a book and my flashlight. Around midnight, I was jarred awake by a faint tapping sound against the tent wall. I froze, heart pounding. At first, I thought it was a branch brushing in the wind, but the taps were too rhythmic, deliberate. Quietly, I unzipped the tent a crack and shone my flashlight outside. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The clearing was shrouded in fog, thick and swirling like smoke. Just beyond the fire pit, I caught a glimpse of something, a pale shape, barely visible, standing motionless among the trees. My breath hitched, and I blinked. The figure was gone. I zipped up the tent quickly, my hands trembling. I told myself it was a trick of the light, or maybe an animal's eyes reflecting the firelight. But sleep was impossible after that. The tapping returned, sometimes at the tent wall, sometimes from the brush nearby. Whispering voices drifted in and out of my hearing, soft and unintelligible. I tried calling out, but my voice sounded small and lost in the thick night. By dawn, the fog was still thick, clinging to the ground and shrouding the trees in ghostly white. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, shivering not just from the cold, but from an unsettling sensation that I was being watched. That's when I noticed the symbols. Carved into several trees surrounding my campsite were strange markings. Circles intersected with lines, arrows pointing downward, shapes I didn't recognize. The bark was fresh and oozing dark sap. I felt my skin crawl. I quickly packed up, but as I made my way down the trail, the forest seemed to close in around me. Shadows flickered just beyond the edge of my vision. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, but when I stopped and turned, no one was there. About halfway back to the trailhead, I found an abandoned cabin hidden among thick brush. It looked forgotten, decades old, but through a broken window I saw a faint flicker of candlelight. My heart pounded as I approached cautiously. Inside, the air was stale and cold. On a rickety table lay a dusty journal. I opened it and found entries written in hurried, nervous handwriting. The author, a woman named Ellen, described a similar camping trip she'd taken many years ago, only she never left. Her last entries spoke of strange footsteps around her tent, voices calling her name, and symbols appearing on trees. She ended with a chilling line, "They won't let me go. The forest is alive, and I am trapped." I dropped the journal and ran back to my car without looking back. The next days were a blur of exhaustion and unease. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me from that forest. Sometimes at night, I hear tapping on my windows and faint whispers just beyond comprehension. I know the forest is still waiting, and it's not done with me yet. Story, the end. The idea of escaping the city for a few days into the wild had been gnawing at me for weeks. Work was suffocating, my apartment felt like a cage, and I craved the kind of silence you only find miles away from civilization. I planned a solo camping trip, one that would force me to be alone with my thoughts, far from cell service, away from everything. I chose a remote area in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Dense forests, rugged terrain, and a reputation for being less traveled, especially late in the season. Early October seemed perfect. The air crisp, the foliage a vibrant mix of golds and reds, but not yet barren. I arrived midday after a long drive on winding mountain roads, parking at a tiny trailhead marked only by a faded sign. The trail was narrow and barely maintained, but I'd done my research and was confident in my map and compass skills. I hoisted my pack and began the trek, the crunch of dead leaves underfoot, the only sound besides the occasional chipmunk darting through the brush. After about 2 hours, I found a clearing on the edge of a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. It was perfect. Enough space to pitch my tent, a nearby stream for water, and just the right balance between open sky and tree cover. I set up camp quickly, eager to get the fire going before sunset. That first night, the forest felt alive. I sat by the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the trees, listening to the sounds of nocturnal creatures stirring. I felt peaceful, centered. The sky was clear, the stars brilliant. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. The temperature had dropped sharply, and the forest was unnervingly still. I caught a faint rustling outside the tent, soft footsteps maybe, but when I peeked out, nothing was there. I chalked it up to animals or the wind, told myself to relax, and went back to sleep. The second day was cooler, with a steady drizzle that turned the soil muddy and the leaves slick. I stayed close to camp, reading a book and tending to my fire. But as the afternoon progressed, the atmosphere shifted. The rain stopped, but a heavy fog rolled in, swallowing the trees and muting the sounds around me. The usual forest chorus was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. Late in the evening, as I prepared to turn in, I heard a faint voice, a whisper carried on the wind. It was so soft I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. I called out, but no reply came. I lay awake for hours, the whispering growing more persistent. Sometimes it seemed to circle the tent. Other times it was distant, just beyond the edge of the clearing. Around 3 a.m., a distinct tapping began on the side of the tent. Slow, measured knocks, like someone knocking on a door. My heart pounded so loud I was sure it would give me away. I unzipped the tent slowly and shone my flashlight into the fog. Nothing, just swirling mist and shadowed trees. I whispered, "Who's there?" No answer. I felt a sudden chill, a coldness that seeped into my bones, and I zipped the tent back up, trying to steady my breathing. The next morning I found odd things around my campsite, small piles of twigs arranged in circles, depressions in the ground as if something had been sitting or kneeling there. None of it looked natural, though I saw no footprints. I decided I wouldn't stay the third night. As I packed my gear, the fog thickened again, and I could swear I heard that whispering voice behind me. I turned quickly, flashlight raised, but nothing. On the trail back, I felt eyes watching me. The forest seemed to close in, shadows stretching unnaturally. Then, just at the edge of a clearing, I saw it. A figure standing motionless, half hidden in the mist. It was a woman, her clothes old-fashioned and tattered, her face pale and expressionless. She raised a hand slowly, beckoning me. I froze, then ran. The forest behind me echoed with that whispering voice, growing louder, desperate. I didn't stop until I reached my car. Later, I learned the area was notorious for disappearances and unexplained phenomena. Locals spoke of a woman who'd vanished on those trails decades ago. Her spirit said to roam, searching for something. Or someone. I've never gone back. Some places aren't meant to be visited alone. Story the end. I remember the trip like it was yesterday, though it happened almost a year ago now. I still can't explain everything that happened out there, and I doubt anyone would believe me. But I know what I experienced was real, at least to me, and it changed the way I think about solitude in the wilderness. I've been camping solo for years. It's a way for me to escape the constant noise of city life, the emails, the endless digital chatter. I love being alone, surrounded only by trees and the stars, feeling small and disconnected from everything. I usually go to familiar spots, well-trodden parks or national forests, where other campers are nearby. But last summer I wanted to try something different, a more remote spot deep in the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. It's a massive forest with rugged terrain and very few visitors in some sections. I found a small clearing near a stream on an old map, a place I thought would be perfect for solitude. I packed light, taking only what I needed for 3 days: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, and a basic first aid kit. My phone barely had signal once I left the main road, so I was committed to complete isolation. I wanted it that way. The hike in was rougher than I expected. No marked trails, just faint game paths weaving through thick brush. I passed fallen trees and glimpsed deer tracks, feeling like I'd stepped back decades in time. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. Not just the typical hush of nature, but a silence that felt almost unnatural. The usual chorus of birdsong and insects was absent. The air was thick and still. By late afternoon, I reached the clearing. It was small, just enough space for my tent and a fire ring surrounded by stones. The stream babbled nearby, and the canopy let in dappled sunlight. I set up camp quickly, eager to relax. As I worked, I kept feeling eyes on me, but whenever I looked up, nothing moved but the leaves in a light breeze. The first night passed without incident. I built a small fire, boiled water, and cooked a simple meal. The stars were brilliant. I felt that familiar peace settling over me as I lay in my tent, listening to the creek. Around 2 a.m., I woke abruptly. It was too dark to see anything, but I sensed something nearby. A faint rustling at the edge of my tent, like someone brushing against the fabric. I froze, heart racing, clutching my flashlight and knife. The noise stopped, and the forest returned to silence. I told myself it was a raccoon or some other animal. I eventually drifted back to sleep, but unease lingered. The next day, the silence remained. No birds, no bugs, no animals. It was as if the forest had been drained of life. I tried to focus on hiking and exploring upstream, but the feeling of being watched never left me. That evening, the tapping started. At first, I thought it was just tree branches knocking together in the wind, but the air was dead still. The taps were rhythmic, soft but deliberate, coming from the dense woods just beyond my firelight. I shined my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam only caught empty shadows and dark trunks. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, staring into the darkness. Around midnight, I heard breathing, slow, heavy, coming from the edge of the clearing. I didn't move. The breathing grew louder, closer. Then, without warning, it stopped. Silence fell again, thick and suffocating. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too afraid to look outside the tent. Morning didn't bring relief. I found small footprints in the damp earth around my camp, not animal prints. These were small, round, almost human, but unlike any tracks I recognized. The prints led in a circle around my tent and disappeared into the forest. I followed the trail briefly, but it vanished among the underbrush. I packed my things quickly, ready to leave. But when I tried to retrace my path back, I realized something terrifying. I was lost. I had no cell signal. My compass spun strangely as if affected by magnetic interference, and the landmarks I'd counted on weren't where I expected. I wandered for hours, heart pounding, trying to find the creek or the clearing. Instead, I found myself deeper in the woods, the trees growing thicker and darker. The tapping resumed, faint at first, then louder, echoing around me. I kept moving, pushing through thorny brush and tangled roots, but the forest felt alive, watching, closing in. Shadows seemed to move just beyond my sight. The air grew colder, my breath visible despite the summer heat. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into another clearing. It was empty except for a single wooden chair, old and weathered, sitting in the center. On the seat was a small stack of stones, flat river rocks, perfectly balanced like a cairn. I approached slowly, my skin crawling. As I reached out to touch the stones, I heard a whisper, barely audible, like wind through leaves. Leave. I dropped my hand and turned around. I ran. I ran until I was exhausted, until the trees thinned, and I saw the trail again. When I finally made it back to my car, I locked the doors and sat inside, shaking. Since then, I haven't returned to that forest. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear tapping on my windows or soft breathing just outside my door. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that chair, empty and waiting. Story the end. The first thing you have to understand about solo camping is that it's a strange balance of exhilaration and vulnerability. When you're alone in the wilderness, the silence can feel like both a gift and a curse. It's a space where your own thoughts echo louder than usual, where every shadow can play tricks on your mind. Most of the time, I loved it. The calm, the solitude, the deep connection with nature. But one trip changed everything. It started as a simple plan. I wanted to get away from the city noise, disconnect for a few days, and hike into the backcountry near a section of forest I'd never explored before. The area was known for its rugged terrain and dense pine trees, with only a handful of established campsites. I packed light but carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for 3 days, a headlamp, a small stove, and my journal. I left early on a Thursday morning, full of anticipation. The hike in was grueling. The trail was steep in parts, littered with loose rocks and fallen branches, but the air was crisp and fresh, the kind that fills your lungs with cold clarity and makes every step feel purposeful. I passed old, gnarled trees, thick moss on the ground, and patches of wildflowers swaying in the breeze. About 4 hours in, I reached a clearing near a small pond, surrounded by thick forest. It felt like the perfect spot to set up camp, sheltered, quiet, and isolated. As I put up my tent, I noticed something odd. A thin layer of fog was rolling in, low and thick, creeping across the pond's surface and swallowing the forest floor. It was early afternoon, and fog this dense, this soon felt unusual. I shrugged it off as a quirk of the microclimate and got on with setting up camp. That evening, after eating and jotting down some thoughts in my journal, I built a small fire. The warmth was comforting against the chill creeping in with the fog. The forest around me seemed still, almost too still. Usually the woods are alive with sounds, birds calling, insects buzzing, leaves rustling, but here everything felt muted. Even the usual chorus of frogs near the pond was absent. It was the kind of silence that presses on your chest. As night deepened, I lay in my tent, reading by flashlight until my eyes grew heavy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Outside, I thought I heard faint footsteps, light, tentative, crunching on the dry pine needles. But when I unzipped the tent to look, the forest was empty, just the faint glow of embers from my fire. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a deer or a small animal. The forest was alive with wildlife, but the footsteps felt too deliberate, too close. The next morning, I awoke to find the fog had thickened, blanketing the forest in a damp gray shroud. I decided to explore the area around the pond. As I walked, the silence was suffocating, broken only by the squish of my boots in wet earth. I noticed strange marks on some of the tree trunks, deep scratches arranged in a crude pattern, circles intersecting with lines, almost like runes or symbols. They looked old, but the cuts were fresh, bleeding sap. Unease crept up my spine. Who else had been here? Was I really alone? I continued walking, following the edge of the pond until I spotted something that made me freeze. A small clearing, and in the middle a crude stone arrangement, a circle of rocks with twigs laid in a pattern inside. It reminded me of something ritualistic, maybe a forgotten offering. I crouched to take a closer look, then noticed something even more unsettling. Footprints. Barefoot, heading into the woods away from the pond. I stood up quickly, the hairs on my neck standing at attention. There was no one in sight, and the forest felt impossibly quiet. I hurried back to camp. That afternoon, I decided to pack up and leave early. The creeping feeling of dread was thickening, and the fog showed no sign of lifting. As I dismantled my tent, I noticed the fire pit was disturbed. Stones shifted, ashes scattered as if someone had been sitting there recently. My stomach churned. I was certain I had extinguished the fire thoroughly the night before. I started hiking back toward the trailhead, but the fog grew denser with each step. Soon, I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. My heartbeat quickened. The forest, which had seemed so inviting the day before, now felt like a trap. The silence pressed in so heavily that I could hear my own breathing in a distorted way, like it was coming from someone else. Then I heard it. A voice. So soft I almost thought I imagined it at first. A whisper, barely more than a breath, calling my name. Sarah. I stopped dead. My name was not Sarah. I called out, but the woods swallowed my voice. The whisper came again, closer this time. Sarah, please. Panic seized me. I tried to retrace my steps, but the trail was gone, erased by the fog. Branches scraped my arms and face as I stumbled blindly through the underbrush. The voice followed me, fading in and out like a broken radio signal. After what felt like hours, I collapsed near a large pine tree, gasping. The fog was beginning to thin as dawn approached. As the first light spilled through the trees, I caught sight of a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. A woman, pale and gaunt, wearing a tattered white dress. Her eyes were dark hollows and her hair hung in matted strands. I blinked and she was gone. Shaken, I forced myself to stand and pushed toward the trail. When I finally emerged back onto the dirt road, the fog had completely lifted. I didn't stop walking until I reached my car, trembling and breathless. That night at home, I tried to make sense of what I experienced. I looked up the area and found reports of a woman who disappeared decades ago, last seen near that very pond. Locals whispered about strange lights in the forest and eerie noises, but no one dared to go deep into those woods after dark. I never went solo camping again. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear the whisper of my name carried on the wind, and I wonder if the woman still waits in the fog, calling to anyone who dares enter her domain. Story the end. The afternoon light was fading when I finally arrived at the small clearing I had chosen for my solo camping trip. I had been planning this for months, escaping the city, disconnecting from everything, and being alone in the woods where no one would find me. I'd spent years hiking and camping, but this spot, tucked away deep in a rarely visited stretch of the Appalachian forest, felt different. It was isolated, quiet, and untouched. My car was parked about a mile back on a narrow dirt road that disappeared into thick woods. The hike-in wasn't long, but was steep and rough in parts. with undergrowth thick enough to snag my legs if I wasn't careful. I didn't see any other people, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustle of squirrels darting through the brush. The air smelled fresh, with the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was just dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows between the trees. The clearing was about 40 feet across, surrounded on all sides by towering trees that stood like silent sentinels. A small creek babbled softly along one edge, its water clear and cool. The ground was soft moss and pine needles, perfect for pitching a tent. I set up camp quickly, moving with the efficiency I'd learned from years of backpacking. The tent went up, my sleeping bag unrolled, and then I gathered wood for a fire. Soon the flames were crackling and glowing warmly in the growing darkness. I cooked a simple meal on my small stove, a packet of freeze-dried pasta, and sat by the fire, sipping water and watching the last light vanish. As night fully settled, the woods grew quiet. No insects buzzed, no frogs croaked, no owls hooted. It was an eerie silence, different from the comforting sounds I was used to hearing at other campsites. The fire's glow pushed back the blackness a few feet around me, but beyond that was just dark. I tried to shake off the creeping unease and lay down in my tent. I had brought a book, but found I couldn't concentrate. My thoughts kept drifting back to the silence, the thick darkness pressing close around my small patch of light. At some point in the night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. Not the light, quick steps of an animal, but slow and deliberate, crunching dry leaves just outside the circle of my firelight. My heart jumped. I unzipped the tent flap and shone my flashlight into the woods. Nothing. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded small and unsure. No answer. The footsteps continued, pacing around the clearing, moving just beyond the firelight's reach. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the steady cadence and near silence didn't fit. I felt eyes on me, but whenever I swept the beam across the trees, I caught only empty trunks and swaying branches. I pulled the tent flap closed and sat frozen, listening. The footsteps slowed, then stopped. Minutes passed. I didn't dare sleep again. At first light, I unzipped my tent and scanned the clearing. The ground was disturbed, with small, deep indentations forming a rough circle around my campsite. They weren't animal tracks, too big, too evenly spaced, like the prints of a person wearing heavy boots, but with an unnatural shape, almost claw-like at the edges. I packed quickly and began hiking out, but the forest felt different, heavier. The silence returned, deeper than before, and the sensation of being watched intensified. I kept looking over my shoulder, but the woods held only shadows. Halfway back to the car, I heard soft whispering on the wind, indistinct words that seemed to drift from the trees. I stopped, straining to listen, but the whispers faded. I broke into a fast walk, my heart pounding. When I reached the car, I locked the doors and sat inside, hands shaking. I tried to convince myself it was exhaustion or my imagination, but the fear stayed with me long after I drove away. That night at home, I examined the photos I'd taken of the clearing. In the firelight's glow, I caught strange shapes in the background, shadowy figures barely visible between the trees, watching. I haven't gone back, but sometimes when the wind is still and the night is silent, I swear I hear slow footsteps circling outside my window. Story the end. The desire to be alone in the wilderness was something I'd felt growing for a long time, a craving for silence so absolute it could drown out the noise inside my own head. I planned a solo camping trip in the remote woods of northern Pennsylvania, where the forest stretched endlessly and cell signals disappeared like smoke. I wanted to find a place untouched by crowds and the modern world, where I could test my own limits and enjoy the raw, unpredictable nature. I arrived mid-afternoon, parking on a gravel road near a forgotten trailhead. The sign was weathered, almost illegible, warning visitors to respect the land, but saying nothing of the dangers that lurked beyond. The trail was narrow and winding, flanked by towering pines and hardwoods, already shedding their autumn leaves. The air smelled of damp earth and moss, and the only sounds were the occasional caw of a crow and the soft crunch of my boots on the leaf litter. I walked for nearly 2 hours, my pack growing heavier with every step until I found a small clearing beside a creek. It was the kind of spot that seemed untouched by human hands, No litter, no fire rings, just a natural hollow where the earth was soft and the trees spread wide enough to let in sunlight. I set up my tent carefully, made a small fire, and let the solitude settle around me like a thick, thick blanket. The first night was quiet, save for the whisper of the creek and the distant calls of night birds. I slept fitfully, dreams drifting in and out, but nothing unsettling. I woke before dawn, the cold air biting at my skin, and watched as the sun pierced through the mist that curled low over the water. The next day, I explored the area more, moving upstream along the creek. The forest thickened, and the trail became harder to follow. I noticed strange things. Small piles of stones arranged in circles, twigs bent into odd shapes, and faint scratch marks on the bark of trees. I took pictures, but tried not to dwell on them too much. After all, I had no reason to believe anything supernatural was happening. These things could be animal activity or the work of other hikers. But as the sun dipped lower and shadows grew longer, I began to feel uneasy. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper. I thought I heard voices, distant but distinct, like whispered conversations just beyond the ridge. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the thick forest. I packed up my camp quickly and hurried back to my clearing, eager to get inside my tent and light the fire. That night, the unsettling sensations escalated. Around midnight, I was awoken by a noise outside the tent, footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the perimeter. I sat up, heart pounding, and shone my flashlight into the blackness. Nothing. The footsteps stopped, but then a soft tapping began on the tent's outer fabric. 3 quick knocks, then a pause, then 2 more. I whispered, "Who's there?" No answer. I grabbed my knife and unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the fog hung thick, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. I called out again, but silence answered me. Suddenly, something brushed past the edge of my vision. A shadow, flickering, moving just beyond the trees. I zipped the tent shut and tried to calm my breathing. Sleep was impossible after that. The following morning, I found footprints circling the clearing, but they weren't human. Too small, too irregular, as if made by something on the tips of claws or with multiple toes. They appeared around the tent and disappeared into the woods without a clear path. I debated leaving, but stubbornness kept me. I told myself the forest was playing tricks on me. The third night was worse. The tapping returned, now more insistent. The whispering voices came closer, like someone right outside the tent, murmuring my name. I refused to open the zipper. At one point, I thought I felt a cold breath on my neck. When dawn finally broke, I packed everything in silence. On the trail back, I stumbled across an old, half-buried tin box, rusted shut. Inside was a faded photograph of a man standing in the same clearing I'd camped in, dated 1954. The back had a handwritten note, "Gone to the woods, not coming back." I left the forest that day, shaken but grateful to escape. The solitude I sought had been found, but at a cost. I never camp alone anymore. Story the end. The sun was just beginning to lower behind the dense pines when I pulled off the narrow gravel road onto a little-used forest path that led deep into the Cascades. It was late September, the air crisp with the promise of early fall, and I'd been craving solitude for weeks. After the relentless buzz of city life and a recent string of stressful work weeks, the idea of a solo camping trip, no phone, no people, just the raw wilderness, felt like medicine. I parked my old Jeep, unloaded my gear, and checked the map one last time before setting off on foot. The trail was rough but familiar to me. I'd hiked in this area a few times before, though never solo this far back. I made my way through the thick forest where the sun slanted through the trees in golden ribbons and the smell of damp earth filled the air. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the pine needles and the occasional rustle of a squirrel or bird. After about 2 hours, I found the clearing I'd picked for camp. It was a small, flat patch near a bubbling stream ringed by towering firs and cedars. The ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves. Perfect. I set up my tent, gathered some dry wood, and built a small fire pit near the stream. I'd brought a compact stove and food, but I like to have a real fire for warmth and comfort. As dusk fell, I sat by the fire with a book, sipping from my water bottle and soaking in the peacefulness. The forest seemed alive, but calm, like it was breathing around me. I noticed how the light dimmed slowly, shadows deepening into a blue-black twilight. The stars came out one by one. I slept deeply the first night, the only interruptions being the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant howl of a coyote. I woke early to the sound of the stream and birdsong, feeling refreshed. The next day, I spent hiking further upstream, following the creek as it wound between mossy boulders and fallen trees. The trail became narrower, less distinct, until I was practically bushwhacking through thick undergrowth. I loved the challenge. When I returned to camp that evening, I noticed something odd. Just at the edge of my clearing, near the fire pit, was a small pile of stones arranged carefully in a circle. It was about a foot in diameter and maybe 6 inches high. I didn't remember putting it there. I looked around for signs of other campers, footprints, broken branches, anything, but saw nothing. I chalked it up to a deer or some animal disturbing the ground, or maybe I'd subconsciously stacked the stones and forgotten. The forest felt too silent for anyone else to be nearby anyway. That night, I lay in my tent, reading by flashlight. Around midnight, I was jarred awake by a sound, slow, steady tapping. It came from outside the tent, near the trees at the edge of my clearing. At first, I thought it was a branch tapping in the wind, but the forest was still. No breeze stirred the air. The tapping repeated. Tap, tap, tap. 6 times in a slow, deliberate rhythm, then a pause, then 6 taps again. It wasn't random, it felt like a message. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to shine the beam out. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the closest tree trunks, but there was nothing there. No animals, no people. My heart pounded. The tapping stopped. Silence fell over the forest again. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe it was some strange echo or my imagination playing tricks. I lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. Around 3 a.m., the tapping began again, this time closer, coming from the other side of my tent. The whispering started then too. Soft, barely audible murmurs that sounded like voices carried on the wind. I strained to hear, but the words were indistinct. The voices seemed to circle around me, moving with the breeze. I grabbed my knife, zipped my tent shut, and huddled in the corner. The tapping continued intermittently until dawn. When morning came, I packed up and tried to shake the uneasy feeling. I went for a longer hike, hoping the fresh air and exercise would clear my head. But the forest felt different. The birds were silent, the underbrush seemed thicker, the shadows deeper. I kept thinking I glimpsed movement out of the corner of my eye, dark shapes darting just beyond the trees, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. I decided to cut the trip short and head back. That's when I noticed the trail had changed. Landmarks I'd memorized were gone. A tree I was certain stood on the right side of the path was now on the left. A boulder I'd passed was missing. My compass needle spun wildly as if disturbed by some magnetic force. The trail seemed to loop back on itself, or worse, vanish completely. Panic set in. I tried retracing my steps, but the forest had become a maze. The tapping started again all around me now, from every direction. The whispers returned, growing louder and more urgent, though still incomprehensible. Suddenly I felt a presence behind me. Heavy breathing, ragged and uneven. I spun around, flashlight flashing frantically into the darkness, but saw nothing. I ran. The trail gave way to dense brush, sharp branches scratching my arms and face. The tapping followed, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind. The whispers turned into words, though I couldn't understand the language. Finally, I stumbled into a small clearing where an old wooden rocking chair sat facing the sky. It was weathered and cracked, as if left there for years. On the chair was another pile of stones, arranged just like the one near my campfire. The air grew ice cold. My breath came out in visible puffs. The chair rocked slowly, as if moved by an unseen hand. Then it stopped. I felt eyes on me. Cold, hollow eyes. I turned to look, but there was nothing. The forest was still. I don't remember how long I stood there. When I turned back to the chair, it had vanished. I found my way back to the car by late afternoon, exhausted and shaken. Since then, I've had trouble sleeping. At night, I sometimes hear tapping on my windows. And I swear, when the wind is just right, I can hear faint whispers calling my name. I never camp alone anymore. Story the end. It was early October when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the remote woods of the Pacific Northwest. I had always loved the solitude and challenge of being alone in nature, and after a particularly draining few months at work, the idea of disconnecting entirely was irresistible. The place I chose was a little-known national forest area, a stretch of old-growth forest with winding trails that only a handful of people ventured into each year. I packed my gear meticulously: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water filter, and a detailed map. I left word with a friend about my destination and expected to return in 4 days. The drive-in was long, the highway giving way to narrow dirt roads riddled with potholes and bordered by towering firs and cedars. I arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon. The sun was beginning its descent, filtering through the tall trees in slanted golden shafts. A light mist hung low in the air, giving the forest an otherworldly glow. I double-checked my pack, strapped it on, and headed in. The trail was soft underfoot, cushioned by years of fallen needles and leaves. I moved steadily, careful to mark my path as I went, but after about 2 miles, the trail narrowed sharply and became less defined. This was intentional. The Forest Service encouraged hikers to stay on established paths, but my destination lay slightly off the main route, a small clearing by a rarely visited creek that I'd read about in an old ranger's journal. By dusk, I found the clearing. It was a small, open space surrounded by towering trees whose limbs arched overhead to form a thick canopy. The creek ran quietly along one side, its water clear and icy cold. I set up my tent quickly, eager to get my fire going before dark fully settled. I gathered dry wood, struck a match, and soon flames flickered and crackled, sending orange light dancing onto the trees around me. Sitting by the fire, I ate my dinner, instant noodles and canned beans, and allowed myself to relax. The forest was alive with the usual sounds of nocturnal creatures, owls hooting distantly, the rustle of small mammals in the underbrush, but something felt off. The sounds were subdued, muted almost, as if the forest was holding its breath. I decided to call my friend to check in, but my phone had no signal. Not surprising in such a remote spot. I shrugged and settled back, staring into the flames. The cold night air crept in, making me pull my jacket tighter. As the fire dimmed, I noticed something, faint footsteps in the soft soil just beyond the ring of light. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the steps were too heavy, too deliberate. I flicked on my flashlight and swept it over the darkness. Nothing. I called out, my voice sounding unnervingly loud. "Hello? Is someone there?" Silence. The footsteps stopped. Then, from the edge of the clearing, I heard a faint whisper. It was so soft I could barely make it out. A voice, female, sighing a single word that sounded like help. I froze, my heart pounding. The fire suddenly sputtered and went out. Darkness enveloped me. I fumbled with my matches, hands trembling. When I got the fire going again, I scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, listening. The whispering returned, fragmented words, incomprehensible but persistent. Sometimes it seemed to be calling my name. At other times it was just an unintelligible murmur. Every so often, footsteps circled the clearing, slow and deliberate, pacing just beyond the firelight. Around 3 a.m., the temperature dropped drastically, and an unnatural stillness descended. I heard a crunching sound, dry leaves being stepped on, right outside my tent. My flashlight's beam penetrated the thin fabric, but nothing was there. Then I felt it, a cold breath, like someone exhaling on my neck. I sat up sharply, heart racing. Outside, the whispers escalated into faint chanting, a low, rhythmic hum that sent chills through my body. Shadows shifted beyond the trees, and I caught a glimpse of pale faces peering from the darkness. Their eyes were hollow, empty, and fixed on me. Terrified, I grabbed my pack and flashlight and tore down the trail in the pitch-black woods, stumbling over roots and stones. The chanting faded but never fully disappeared, lingering like a nightmare behind me. I reached my car just before dawn, breathless and shaking. The forest was silent again, the mist lifting as the sun rose. When I reviewed the photos I'd taken, I noticed something odd. Faint figures blurred in the background, shadows that didn't match the shapes of trees, faces that appeared and vanished in the flame light. Later, I found out the clearing was near a site where, a century ago, a group of settlers vanished without a trace. Locals told stories of restless spirits, victims of an old massacre. Some said the forest itself was cursed, trapping souls forever. I never camped alone again. Story. The end. The wind shifted just as the last rays of sunlight slipped through the dense canopy above me. It was October, and the air had that unmistakable sharpness that hinted at the approaching winter, biting at my exposed skin with every gust. I had been hiking for hours, the weight of my backpack settling comfortably on my shoulders, my boots pressing firmly into the soft earth of the Appalachian forest. I wasn't new to solo camping. This was, in fact, my third trip this year. But there was something different about this particular patch of wilderness, something that both intrigued and unsettled me. The trail had been steep and rough, winding along an old logging road before disappearing into an overgrown path marked only by the occasional faded blaze on the trees. I had followed my map carefully, knowing that few ventured this far off the beaten track. The forest around me was thick, with towering oaks, maples, and pines, their leaves rustling softly in the evening breeze, but the usual chorus of birds and woodland creatures had quieted to a near silence. Even the creek that usually bubbled nearby was subdued, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. By the time I reached the clearing I'd marked on my map, twilight was fading fast. The clearing was small and secluded, ringed by ancient trees that stretched skyward, their skeletal branches intertwined like fingers reaching for something unseen. The ground was carpeted with a thick layer of pine needles, soft and dry beneath my feet. I set down my pack, feeling the familiar rush of relief that always came with finding a good spot to camp. My routine was methodical: pitch the tent, gather firewood, start a fire, prepare dinner. I moved quickly, my fingers numbed slightly by the chill, but practiced and sure. The firelight soon flickered and danced, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to stretch beyond the clearing and into the dark woods. I sat close to the flames, sipping lukewarm coffee from my thermos and letting the warmth seep into my bones. Despite the comfort of the fire, the silence pressed in around me, heavy and unnatural. I found myself scanning the tree line more often than usual, expecting at any moment to catch a glimpse of movement, a deer, a raccoon, maybe even another hiker, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive stillness. As the night deepened, I began to hear it. Soft, deliberate footsteps crunching through the dry leaves beyond the firelight. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness, illuminating nothing but swaying branches and gnarled roots. I called out, voice steady but low, "Hello?" The only answer was the whisper of the wind through the trees. The footsteps circled the clearing, slow and measured, too purposeful to be an animal. I felt a cold prickle run down my spine, but I told myself it was probably a lost hiker or a curious deer. Still, the unease lingered, growing with every passing minute. The footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint whispering carried on the wind. I strained to make out the words, but they were indistinct, a soft murmur that seemed to ebb and flow like the tide. I zipped myself into my tent, heart pounding, and lay awake for hours. Outside, the footsteps returned, pacing slowly in the darkness, circling my campsite like a predator stalking prey. The whispers continued, occasionally rising to a low chant that sent chills racing down my spine. I tried to focus on my breathing, to calm the rising panic, but sleep was impossible. At dawn, I emerged from the tent to find the ground around my camp disturbed. Deep footprints pressed into the pine needles formed a rough circle around the clearing. I knelt to inspect them more closely. They were large, elongated, with claw-like impressions where toes should have been. I took photos with my phone, the images crisp despite the early light. I packed up quickly, the oppressive atmosphere making it hard to think clearly. As I retraced my steps back along the trail, I felt eyes watching me from the shadows. Flickers of movement caught my peripheral vision, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. The whispers seemed to follow me, soft voices just beyond hearing. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors and sat inside, heart still hammering. I tried to rationalize the experience: stress, exhaustion, overactive imagination, but the photos and the footprints were undeniable. Later, researching the area, I discovered stories of an ancient burial ground nearby, warnings from locals about strange disappearances and unexplainable phenomena in the forest. I had stumbled into something old and restless. I haven't returned, but sometimes late at night when the wind is still and the house is silent, I swear I hear footsteps circling outside my window, slow and deliberate, as if the forest itself is still watching. Story the end. I decided to go on a solo camping trip in mid-October, not because I was particularly outdoorsy, but because I needed to get away. My girlfriend and I had just broken up. Work was suffocating and the world felt too loud. Uh, there's a lake called Jennings Hollow about 2 hours from where I live in Oregon, known to be quiet and secluded. The Park Service had shut down most of the campsites for the season, but you could still hike in and pitch a tent as long as you followed the posted guidelines. I figured I wouldn't see another soul for days, which sounded perfect. The first day was uneventful in the best way. I hiked out 4 miles into a ravine area, nestled behind the lake, where the trees grew dense and the light filtered in like stained glass. It was cold but dry, and the air smelled like cedar and damp leaves. I found a perfect clearing near a stream, flat enough for my tent, close enough to fresh water, and surrounded on all sides by trees. It felt hidden, like a little pocket in the woods where nothing could bother me. I set up camp and cooked dinner over a small fire. As the sun dipped below the tree line, I wrapped myself in a blanket and just listened to the sounds around me. Branches creaking, wind whistling, a distant owl. There was a deep calm in the woods that night. I turned in early, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and let the quiet lull me to sleep. I woke up sometime around 1 a.m. It was the kind of waking that feels like something pulling you out of a dream, sharp and sudden. At first, I thought I heard something, a voice, maybe, but it faded the second I opened my eyes. I lay there, perfectly still, and waited. The wind had stopped. The forest was silent. Too silent. No rustling, no animals, not even the stream sounded right. It was like everything had paused. Then I heard it again. A single knock. Not on the tent, but close. A knock like someone rapping their knuckles against a tree. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Then nothing. I waited, clutching my flashlight, but didn't turn it on. After a few minutes, I told myself it could have been a branch falling or an animal stepping on something. I eventually fell back asleep, though it took longer than I'd like to admit. In the morning, I searched the area. I half expected to find signs of someone else camping nearby, but there was nothing. No footprints, no tire tracks, no broken branches, just woods and quiet and the distant gurgling of the stream. The second night, I stayed up later, reading by flashlight, trying not to think about the knock. I didn't hear anything unusual at first. I finally nodded off sometime past midnight. This time, I woke up to the sound of someone breathing. It was faint but unmistakable. Shallow, irregular breaths just outside the tent. I held my breath, listening. It didn't move, it didn't speak, just breathed. I turned on my flashlight and shone it against the tent wall, casting a soft glow outward. Nothing. The breathing stopped. I counted to 30, then unzipped the flap and stepped out. No one was there. But it felt wrong. The air had that charged feeling like right before a lightning storm, and it was cold, much colder than it had been before. I could see my breath, which made no sense. It hadn't dropped below freezing the night before. I circled my campsite and returned to the tent. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I planned to leave the next morning. Whatever solitude I'd been looking for wasn't worth the creeping dread that had wrapped itself around the place. But I made the mistake of lingering. I boiled water for coffee, sat by the stream, and tried to shake the unease. Maybe it was in my head. Maybe I'd been too wired up from city life and the stillness was just too unfamiliar. By the time I packed up and started heading back, it was already early afternoon. I knew I wouldn't make it to the car by dark, so I decided to camp one last night closer to the trailhead. I found a spot near a small ridge about a mile out from the parking area. Less dense trees, more open sky. I felt safer. I even managed to laugh at myself a little, thinking how ridiculous I must have looked freaking out over creeks and shadows. That night was calm. I made a small fire, roasted the last of my food, and even listened to music on my phone for a bit. I was exhausted, so I turned in around 9 p.m., figuring I'd hike out at sunrise. I don't know what time I woke up, but I woke up sweating, heart racing, gripped by a terrible feeling that someone was watching me, not from a distance, close, right outside. I didn't hear anything at first. No breathing, no footsteps. Then I heard a whisper, clear as day. "Let me in." I froze. The voice was low and calm, almost like it was trying to be soothing. But it wasn't. It was wrong. Too steady. Too quiet. Like it wasn't meant for ears. "Let me in." Again, the same tone, a hair quieter. I sat up, clutching my knife and flashlight. My hands were shaking. I didn't speak. I didn't move. Then slowly, the zipper on my tent started to move. Just a few inches. Then it stopped. I yelled, "Who's there?" No answer. I threw the tent open and swung the flashlight around. No one. Nothing. But the zipper. It had been opened. Not from the inside. From the outside. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat with my back against a tree, my flashlight trained on the tent. The woods stayed quiet, but that same electric pressure lingered. I left before dawn, half hiking, half jogging the last mile to my car. When I got there, something was off. My car was unlocked. I always double check. Always. But the doors were slightly ajar, and when I opened the driver's side, I found something on the seat. A single pine cone, still damp with morning dew. I stared at it for a long time before tossing it and slamming the door. I didn't breathe easy until I hit the main road and left the forest behind me. Back home, I tried to write it off. Lack of sleep, stress, being alone for too long. But deep down, I knew what I felt out there wasn't my imagination. 3 weeks later, I started hearing knocks on my apartment wall. Always 3, always late at night. No one was ever there. Sometimes I dream of a face outside my tent. Pale, expressionless, waiting. I don't camp alone anymore. Story the end.